Okay, hello everyone. Um, Welcome today. My name's Emma Haley. I'm from the publishing house Self-Made Hero here in London. I'd like to welcome you today to today's topic, which is where do comics stand in the representation of diversity? And I'd like to welcome our panelists. And at the moment, I can't see our panelists. There they are. Great. Hello. I thought I was on my own there. Great relief to see your faces. I have three panelists today talking about this wonderful topic of comics and diversity. There's Woodrow Phoenix.
Bonjour.
Lucy Kemener. Hi, Lucy.
Hello. Hi.
And Barak Rima. Hi, Barak.
Hi.
And thank you very much to the audience for watching today. If any of you have any questions, then just pop them in the chat and we'll try and get to them sort of as and when, or maybe at the end. We'll do our best on that. I'd like to begin, first of all, by introducing our first panelist, Barak Rima. Barak was born in Tripoli, Lebanon in 1972. He lives in Brussels and is a comics artist and filmmaker. He is a member of the Beirut-based Samandal Comics Association. And his most recent comics are Dans le Taxi and Beirut, la trilogy, both published by Aleph Bata. Welcome, Barak.
Welcome.
So Barak, your latest work, Dans le Taxi, which is set in Lebanon, is, in your own words, about childhood, heritage, bisexuality, and transformation. So for people unfamiliar with your work, perhaps you'd like to just tell us a little bit about your latest book.
It's probably easier for other people to talk about my book than myself. Yeah, it's about childhood, so it also means it's about heritage, what we inherit from our ancestors on a cultural, lingual backgrounds, also on philosophical backgrounds, and probably a lot of other things and things that we don't know also we inherit. And we also choose to invent new forms of identities or discover new form of cultures in many levels, and we have diversity inside of ourselves. We live diversity inside and also diversity outside. So yeah, this book is brings us back to the city of my childhood, Tripoli, and it brings us to the childhood. I always tell my story. It's autobiographical work, but the objective is to share an experience with the people and to make something universal. It's not only about my story. So I think we are able, as a human beings, to select what we want from our heritage and to choose what we want as identity or and diverse identity. Well, I think the book talks about this, but I'm not sure because I have to. I don't have enough distance. There's somebody else who should talk about it. But this is what I try to live and to experience and to draw in my work.
If I maybe share a few pages from Dans le Taxi, perhaps you could maybe walk us through a few of the pages.
I can try.
You can try. Great, thank you. Okay. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes. Yes.
So where does this start, this journey?
This is the first page of the book. This is really the first page. It says, Après Beyrouth, j'ai décidé de retourner à Tripoli. It means after Beirut, because I made another book before, it's called Beirut, the trilogy. So I want to tell the reader that after that book, I'm going somewhere else and I'm going to Tripoli. After Beirut, I decided to go back to Tripoli. This is where I was born, on the back siege of a collective taxi. So,
And is this autobiographical?
mm. But I like to mix genre, and I don't care about the borders. Not borders between countries, and also borders between aesthetic genre. So I want to work with documentary and with autobiography, but I also want to mix with fantasy, because I was not born in a taxi. I was born in a hospital, like the most of the people. But I like the idea of uh, um, comment dire tricher, cheating with what is true and what is not true. But anyway, what is true is that I decided to go back to Tripoli, to the city where I was born. And this book is maybe less political and social than Beirut, La Trilogie, because I'm going back to where I was born and where I lived my childhood. So it's more personal, and maybe more related to family issues, more than political issues. And family issues mean also family secrets and family um, traumas that we might inherit from our parents, direct parents, father and mother, but that you can inherit also from very old past ancestors that you can see here, for example, in this image. Because in this story, in this city, Tripoli, where I was born, there were a lot of massacres and battles and wars between here you can see the Crusaders and the Phoenicians and in the recent period of the civil Lebanese war. All this history we have it like in our heritage, even if there are something we didn't really experience directly, but we have them in the collective subconscious.
And I love the way that you're mixing mediums here, and you have are those real photos of your family and of you in there?
Some of them are real photos, some of them are fake photos.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I use some collage photos, and I also use photos to draw. All my drawings are based on documentation, photographic documents.
Mm-hmm.
I need them like techniques. So everything is documented, and in this documentary part, there are like old parts of the history of the city. I mixed the Crusades with the Arabic period, with the contemporary period. It's a lot of mix. There are a lot of mixes in the chronology, but I wanted to summarize the history of the city before I start talking about the family stories.
Yeah. And there seems to be a lot of historical context in your book, talking about the the background of Lebanon and what has happened there. So there's a lot of non-fiction, and that seems to be important as part of the backdrop and as part of your story.
Mm. I didn't understand your last sentence.
It seems to be the history or the historical context that you have put into your graphic novel is important to you and to your story.
Um, well, yes, and it was maybe necessary to me for me to make a summary of the history of Tripoli, which usually we don't know enough because a lot of the narratives in the Lebanese comics, but also in literature and cinema, is about Beirut. Very few is about other places in Lebanon, actually.
Mm.
And so I wanted to show it's a kind of touristic guide also because I wanted to show how specific is this town. It's very oriental town, very different from Beirut, and at the same time very cosmopolitan, but in a very different way. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's only a small part in the book. After that, I go into the personal story.
And what's happening in this spread here?
Sorry, here I'm telling a dream. It's where I'm going up on the stairs to visit my mother in the psychiatric hospital. It's a sequence of a dream I have made. I use dreams in my work. Um, it gives me a lot of important and strong symbols. So here it's I'm going to visit my mother, but the page after we don't know what happens because I switch to the next sequence. Um, and in the end of the book, I go back to the dream and I finish to tell the dream. But this I won't tell you.
Fair enough. You don't want to spoil it for all of us. You live in Belgium now, but originally you're from Lebanon. How do the two countries relate in terms of diversity in comics? How would you compare them?
I don't know in comics, but in everything else, these are two places made artificially out of consensus of different nations, different languages, different communities, different in the idea of it's not state nation, you know. There is no Belgian nation. There is no Lebanese nation. It does not exist. But there's idea of citizenship, and this is something I find interesting in small countries, in small places like this, that there are carrefour. It's a mixed place, a melting pot place between north and south, between east and west, between in Belgium between the French and Latin languages and the German and Flemish languages. Is also very important. Um, I have lived until my 18 years in Lebanon, which is a multi-confessional and multilingual place, and I came to Brussels, which is also a multilingual and multicultural place. Relating to the comics, it's quite different because Belgium has a very old and long story of comics, which Lebanon does not have. Uh, I, I mean, it's not as long and as old than the French Belgian comic history. And if I am in Belgium, it's because I came here to study comics, and this is why I came here and I stayed 30 years later.
Fantastic. We have some more pages of your other book, the the trilogy. Shall I share my screen if you'd like to
Mhm.
just walk us through those?
Beirut, la trilogy is it's a trilogy because it's made of three books, originally published separately by Lebanese publisher Plan B. So there were three different books: Beirut, Beirut Bye Bye, and Beirut Rewind. Uh, this is the first one, Beirut, the first Beirut. Uh, it's the three dates of three times how do you say, the point of view over the city in three different uh, historical periods. The first one is 1995, so it's very long time ago, and it was a few years after the city went out of the civil war, and where everything was possible, and there was a lot of hope of making everything new after the war. Um, and it was a period where I had 25 years old, so I was also plenty of hope. The second part, Beirut Bye Bye, this one, Beirut Bye Bye, that was 20 years later, in 2015. And it's a totally dystopic point of view over Beirut. It starts with the autobiographical, very realistic and banal scene with me and my wife and my daughter in Beirut, and some crocodiles and aliens invade the city and they throw us away. So we have to hurry up and run away from them, and the city becomes like very violent for people who don't have a lot of money and powerful and rich people. And here you can see also the fanatic part with all these veiled women invading the sky. Books are burning and tires are burning, and we have to flee. And the end of the book, we just the city is burning, and we have to run away. And then, so here it's also a very big mix between a documentary part, because what I'm telling about is really happening in Beirut, not in this form, but in a similar form. Spaces are being privatized, people are being thrown away from the city, and people are protesting. So here you can see we are passing through the town, and we can see some people in the background going to a demonstration. This is the first part, the third part of the book, Beirut Rewind, where I tell the story of the protests that started in 2015, and these protests are recurrent. They started in 2015 and then again in 2019, and every time it's bigger. But it's a situation of reject of the whole political system and the whole the oligarchy that is governing the country. So yeah, it's again a mix of very realistic and documentary scenes with fiction and science fiction and auto-fiction. For example, here I meet this character who is pushing the books on his chariot, and he makes me travel in the time. We go back to the 60s, where it was another period of protests in Beirut and in the Arab world, and then we go back to the present, and when we go through the time, we meet here like in this panel, refugees, which are always out of time. Refugees, they could be Palestinians, they could be Syrians, they could be from Afghanistan, from Sudan, from anywhere in the planet. Um, and here we come back to Beirut in the present time. That was August 2015. And here I start again like a very documentary scene where I describe the uh, how do you say the when you throw something, the rubbish,
Mhm.
the when you throw your things in the streets.
Yeah.
Uh,
Rubbish. Yeah.
yeah, so there was a crisis because for 30 years in Lebanon, the government they used just to take the rubbish and throw it somewhere in a place and then put it. And this place it's got totally full and saturated. There are no more places to put rubbish. So they just left them in the street, and there was no sorting, never, ever. And the protest was from people were saying this government is just taking money to his pocket, and he's not doing any efficient public service. And of course, after things went much worse, and you probably have heard that last year there was a very big explosion in the harbor of Beirut that made a lot of uh, dead people and wounded and people without houses and everything. And it's also another uh, uh, example of incompetence of this ruling uh, um, uh, political system. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then this is me again in the story, and I'm taking a taxi because the taxi is always also a figure in my work. And the driver, um, he says that actually um, here he says I look like a taxi driver, but in reality I am a hakawati. A hakawati is somebody who tells the stories. It was like a job in the past before we invented cinema and television. There was a man who goes in the bar, in the cafe, where he used to tell the story for the people. And here he is in the taxi. He's the taxi driver. And then there are no more light, and then we go inside the next page is inside the yeah the all the struggle of this time. It's a summary of many struggles, many demonstration for the equality of men and women, for the public space, for liberty of expression, for environment, everything. Yeah. And then we have like this lady coming into the taxi because it's a collective taxi. You know, in Lebanon, the taxi is not a car that you pay for yourself and you take for yourself. You go into a taxi, but there are other people in the taxi that people you don't know necessarily. It's like a bus. And so people go up and down from the taxi. And here there's a woman who comes in the taxi, and we arrive in a house, in an apartment, where there is a ziyara. It's where people just talk and discuss, and they are sitting all together. And the driver is still there, and he's still driving the taxi. And here is my daughter and my wife. They come and they help me to finish the book because I didn't know how to finish it.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Um, thanks very much, Derek. How important is it for you to talk about the issues surrounding sexual and gendered identity in your comics?
Well, actually, it's not so much in my comics. It's among other things. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe in the taxi, it's the first one where I directly um, um, talked about sexuality and draw sexuality. But I also made it in some other works I used to publish in magazines. Don't have a lot of books, actually. I have three of them. Dans le taxi, Beirut, trilogy, and another one, Le Compteur du Caire, like very old one, 20 years ago. But I have made a lot of short stories in magazines, also in the press, in newspapers, like sections. And one of the works I published in Samandal magazine also talks about sexuality. It's a work in Arabic that would be translated in English to "Nap Before Noon," the name of the work. And well, I'm working on an English translation. Uh, I hope to I hope to publish this work anyway in Arabic also, but I hope to publish it in I don't know how many time, but the next years. Also about sexuality and about androgyne archetype, and also using my dreams.
I'd love to be able to read that in English at some point. It'd be great. Thank you so much, Barak. Um, our next panelist is Lucy Kemener. Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Lucy was born in Paris in 1998. She's French with a Chinese background. Her first graphic novel, Bon du Tigre, was published just last year by Delcourt. The book received the Prix France Culture Bande Dessinée des Étudiants 2020 and is selected for 2 prizes at this year's Angoulême Festival. The Prix Fauve de l'Essayé. I'm apologizing now for my French accent. Sorry, everyone. Sorry. Just bear with me. And the second prize is the Prix du Public France Télévision. So, Lucy, your debut graphic novel, Baume de Tigre, which in English translates to Tiger Balm. I'd just like to, for anyone unfamiliar with Tiger Balm, here is my little pot of Tiger Balm to take everywhere with me. It's been published to great critical acclaim, Lucy, and it talks about the relationship between 4 third-generation sisters. Would you like to describe a little bit about the book to those unfamiliar with your work?
Yes, the book talks about an Asian immigrant family who is ruled by an authoritarian grandfather, and the eldest of the granddaughter, Eda, breaks with his expectation by wanting to go to university instead of taking back the Asian family restaurant. And she brings her sister into a sort of revolt, hunger strike, and so on against the oldest generation, but eventually, in the end, she will reconnect with her culture and Asian background. And with this book, I wanted to tell a sort of post-immigrant story, like once you're settled in a new country and have kids, and not everything is solved. And talking about my experience of a third generation immigrant, because I myself have always been told that having two culture is a gift, but I wanted to show it also as a burden and a responsibility to your family.
Absolutely, and I'm just going to share my screen and show a few pages from Baume du Tigre. Here we go. Okay, so Lucy, if you could just sort of set up the scene here for the audience.
Yeah, so this is a just the first pages of the book, and the main character Eda, she received her letter from her university, her medical school, and so she learns that she will like take a different path from what her parents and grandparents have planned for her. After she will have a fight and leave the house. The main characters are the Eda and her sisters, but I also wanted to show the life of her mother and grandmother, showing the different generation. And I wanted to make a determinist story, showing that what the main characters think they're doing, they think it's a choice, but it actually consequences of the action of the grandparents and parents. Like they think they're breaking with the family by wanting to run away from the house, but we learn that it's actually something her mother and her grandmother wanted to.
Okay, and I'm just fast forwarding here.
Yeah, so this is the first chapter, and we see just the life of every day to introduce the characters and the dynamic of the family with the grandfather who controls the life of her granddaughter, of his granddaughter.
So yeah, it raises sort of questions of heritage, the older and younger generations, and of a woman's place in that. And I was wondering, how do you feel about the representation of women in comics? Is it something that you think about when you are creating your female characters?
Yeah, it is. In my first wishes about this book, I wanted to make new representation of women. I mean, when I grew up, I have almost no representation of Asian women, and especially white Asian women. So I thought when I grow up, I will do I will write characters that look like me in some way. So yeah, it's been a real question. I wanted to talk about also women's struggle and feminism. I think it's a subject that matters to a lot of new generation of also. I mean, there always been some women author, but I think now there is sorry, I'm searching for my word, but yeah. Now there is a new generation with a lot of women authors, and they want to tackle this issue and bring, I think, a new representation of women, and as I tell more feminist story about women's struggle, but also in a most diverse range of subject and genre. And I think, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And what struck me in what you said just earlier is you wanted to tell stories or depict people that look like you. Do you find that isn't so much the case in what's being produced in France at the moment?
Oh no, not at all. I think I mean about my experience about being Asian in comics especially, but in movies too, I guess. There is not a lot of place for Asian character. Every Asian character is always shown as some sort of otherness. It's always it's never a main character, and it's always strange people who are outside the world of the main character. The Asian culture is always depicted as some nice exotic background. So the white character can just bring his own questions and feel just with his own existential dread and this kind of thing. And the Asian culture will just be like some background, some blank space. And so yeah, I think there's not a lot of Asian representation in comic book. In France, I think it's also a difficult discussion because the industry is very white dominated, and we don't really talk about race or this kind of thing. Like this kind of discussion wouldn't happen in France. It's difficult to step out the militant sphere. So there is it's quite a difficult subject now, but I hope that the next generation will bring more of this question and will be more aware on those things, and maybe there will be some changes. I hope.
Yeah, and I mean, you are the next generation, and do you find that your contemporaries are telling different sorts of stories, and that the representation of ethnic minorities and Asian or Chinese, in your case, is coming more to the fore in a way that perhaps it hadn't been in the past?
Yeah, I think it's very true for the representation of women, but for the representation of people of color, I think it will take more time because from just what I see, there is a lot of new female author, but not so much of author of color. So this kind of subject is still in the hand of white author. So I guess it will take more time, but about the representation of women, I perceived a big change this last year. There's been a lot of discussion about that since a few years, and now even male authors feel concerned and want to come on board and catch up with this subject. So I think it's more a thing.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. I think we're running a little low on time, so I think we may go to our next panelist. Thank you so much, Lucy. Our final panelist is Woodrow Phoenix. Hi, Woodrow.
Hi.
Hello. Woodrow grew up in South London. He's a writer, an artist, and a graphic designer based both in London and Cambridge. His work has appeared in UK newspapers and comics collections across Europe, the US, and Japan, and in television projects for Walt Disney and the Cartoon Network. His comic books include Rumble Strip, the anthology Nelson, and the experimental She Lived. His most recent book, Crash Course, was released last year. Woodrow, would you like to kick off by showing some examples of your books, Crash Course and Rumble Strip, perhaps?
Okay. In some ways, it's quite a useful thing to show those because we're talking about representation and how representation works. And in my thinking about how to make complex narratives, I came up with this idea to show this book that I made with no people in it, because I wanted to do this thing where I wanted to involve the reader fully in the narrative that I was explaining. And one of the things about comics, well, not just comics, but in fact all kind of narrative media, is that generally what you do is you have to identify with a character, a person who becomes the avatar that you interact with the story through. And of course, most of the time that person is a white male. And if you are not a white male, then you are going to have to do some mental work to put yourself in their shoes. And we're used to doing that because, we have to. Otherwise, we could never interact with any stories. So we all get used to putting ourselves in the shoes of this person. But of course, it is distancing. So I was thinking about ways to get across the idea of this book and what this book is about, which is it's about cars and how cars deform our world and how they make strange choices that we all have to live with. So I had to come up with a way to get across the weirdness of the whole topic, because the idea behind it, of course, as you can see on the cover, is if you want to get away with murder, buy a car. The idea being that we live in a world that is totally dominated by the choices that we have made as a society to use cars to get people around. And the way that we live is totally dominated by this choice. And people get killed by cars all the time, a lot. It's the biggest and the most prevalent form of death in the world, more than war, more than illness, more than anything you can think of. You know, millions of people a year die in crashes, which is, it's kind of an astonishing figure, you know, a million people a year. But it's true, it's real. So I wanted to write about this, and I wanted to get across how weird this idea was. So I had to come up with a way to get the reader to think about the oddness of this situation. So that's why I decided to A, get rid of people, so you're just looking at the objects, and B, start with the objects themselves. So the metaphor that I used here is the idea that if you were to be walking along the street that had grand pianos dangling from ropes above you, you would not feel very comfortable, because these things could fall and crush you at any time. And you might want to go someplace else and walk someplace else, but you can't, because the pianos are everywhere. So how do you make sure that the people who control those pianos are responsible, they're not drunk, they're not distracted, they're going to take care of those pianos, and they're not going to let them crush you? And it becomes a real kind of public health issue, and it becomes an issue of trust and an issue of how you decide to apportion those streets and things like that.
I am not seeing your pages. I don't know if other people are.
Ah, okay. I think I forgot through the screen sharing bit, didn't I? So I'm talking to you and I'm looking at my screen, but of course you can't see it.
No.
Right. There you go. Thanks for the reminder. Okay. There we go. So can you see that?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Right. Good. Okay. So you'll have to just imagine that everything I said just now comes with the pictures that I'm showing you of the two books. So Crash Course is an updated version of Rumble Strip that I did first. Rumble Strip was the starting of this idea of showing people by immersion a visual thing that they could put themselves into. So as you can see, there are no people here. But as you read the captions, you put yourself in the place of what would be a person, and that way you become fully absorbed in the story. And this sounds like a strange idea, but if you actually start reading it, it works completely well, and you're totally absorbed into the telling of the story, and you don't think about, you know, what's missing, because you supply that yourself. And this is actually a very good technique for getting people who don't read comics to read them, because they don't have to do that extra step of identifying with somebody on the page. They just are there. You just are reading it. And it means that people who don't read comics normally can read these things very, very easily. And I found it to be a really effective way to get through to people who don't read comics. This particular section that I'm showing you here deals with another aspect of the whole way that we have ceded huge parts of our world to cars, which is that cars themselves become an area of control for people who are not necessarily able to handle that themselves. In this case, it means that black people in particular get harassed by police because they're in cars. Cars become a very convenient way to stop people and to mess with them and to injure them. So I covered in Crash Course the deaths of 6 people in particular who were shot by police in the US because of the cars they were in. And again, because there are no people here, you put yourself in the place of those people and you think about what it feels like to be them and be where they were. These pictures are actually of the places where the deaths occurred. So they're pretty grim, really. But I wanted people to think about that, to think about what it might feel like to be there in those places. And I use that technique in other strips too. So this is also where Heather Heyer was killed by the neo-Nazi who ran her over during the demonstration. And this is a different strip. This is a strip that was done for Art magazine. And as you can see, this is a street in Paris. And if you read the captions, what you realize is that this is the street that contained the offices of Charlie Hebdo, who were all killed by that gunman. And that in itself is shocking and horrifying. But not more than a couple of weeks later, a great many number of people more were killed by also terrorist attack, as you can see here. And it was very difficult to find the names of these people or to find their faces. You know, the attack in France was very well covered in the media. There was so much information about who the people were, what happened to them, everything. But for this bunch of people who were killed in Garissa, it took me, I don't know, a whole day of just endless searching to find a web page and then some entries in Facebook or something where I actually found the information. It was not there in the media. And I thought that spoke a lot to who is given importance and whose deaths matter and whose deaths don't matter. And so this became a kind of memorial piece. So that these are the names of all those people who died, and these are the faces of some of them. And a thing happens when people die. When it's one or two people, you can visualize them very clearly and you can understand about them and you can put yourself in their place. When it's 113 people, like here, suddenly you realize the limits of the human imagination. It's like it's not really possible to identify with and empathize with that many people. So you just kind of give up. But you know, you have to try. You have to keep trying to understand and to feel it and not let it just overwhelm you. So yeah, question.
Yeah, it's a very powerful image, that actually. Yeah, quite struck by it. Woodrow, you've been part of the UK comic scene for decades now. Have you seen much change in terms of the representation of diversity in comics?
Let me unshare for a second. I've seen some changes, yes, I guess I have. There are more different kinds of comics being produced now. There are more different kinds of people who are making them. But that's as much to do with the fact that people are doing these things for themselves rather than waiting for someone to ask them. And I think the biggest issue really is the fact that, you know, we're talking about diversity and we're talking about that as a direct consequence of the kind of racist world that we live in. And there's no getting away from the fact that actually, some ways this is not really a conversation for non-white people to be having, because we are not the people who are causing this problem. You know, it's like if you were to interview cows and say, what do you think about hamburgers? Should people be eating them or not? What do you think? It's like, what do you think a cow would say about that? You know, it's not up to a cow to decide whether we eat hamburgers or not. It's up to the people who buy them and cook them. And so it's kind of the same for us, really. It's like, yeah, we will talk about these things because we have our own solutions to make our lives livable, but we are not people who can change this in any concrete way, because that comes from the top. You know, this is white people talking to other white people about how they live and what they do. And unless those changes come from the publishers and from governments and from everyone who has the ability to actually make some concrete changes, then it doesn't really matter what we do. You know, we can make our lives better on a personal level and even on a kind of group level, but ultimately that's going to have to come from somewhere else. And so, yes, so what's happening is that people are making what they can to improve these things. And we are all making images that reflect what we understand about the world we live in and that include us in them. And yeah, that's not always a very straightforward thing to do. We do have publishers now who are trying to do something about that and redress that balance a bit and commission more things that are reflecting more of what society looks like now. But there's pushback all the time on that. And I mean, sometimes it's just about paying attention, you know. It's like it's a weird thing that happens when people are not used to seeing things that don't look like they expect. They kind of almost don't see them because it's not what they're looking for. I had a funny conversation with a friend of mine who asked me, so why is it that I don't see, you know, many black characters in the comics that you make? And I was kind of astonished by this because I said to him, maybe you should go back and take another look at, you know, at these books of mine that you say that you've read. And, you know, if you look at my work, you know, black characters are all through them all the time. But it's just because they're not obviously talking about racial issues. You know, they're just people. They're just people in funny things doing their own stuff. It's like maybe it doesn't register for some people that these are different. In some ways, that's a really good thing, because it's not like we spend our time thinking about our differences as being significant in some way. They're just stories, and they should just be stories. In other ways, it's kind of depressing, because it means that people are so kind of coded to think in racialized terms that even when something is not presented that way, they can't really see it unless they're looking for it. So it's not just about what we do, it's also about how people's brains have to change and how they have to start thinking in different ways, different terms.
Yeah, thinking and seeing things in different ways. What else do you think publishers should be doing to address this sort of imbalance in the UK publishing scene?
Well, commissioning more stuff that has to do with experiences that go with everybody and not just a certain part. I mean, there have been changes. So I did this strip last year for The Observer, and it was commissioned for a special issue that was edited by Steve McQueen, who's a black filmmaker, and he's made a series of films about the black experience in Britain in the 70s. And that would never have happened, 10 years ago at all. It would never have happened. So that is a big difference. Even though the strip itself managed to create plenty of controversy just by the mere fact of its existence and saying these things that people think should not be said, even though people are saying them all the time. But then something else I think that's useful to do is to just try to do what you can to redress that balance. So right now I'm involved in an initiative which, Self-Made has done to get more non-white illustrators into comics. So I'm going to be mentoring some people, and we're going to be making an anthology comic based on the work of these people who have never made comics professionally before and probably would never get the chance to if not for programs that gave them the opportunity to be mentored, to find out how comics work and to make things professionally. So those kinds of adjustments are things that we can do ourselves personally, and those things are all important to do.
Yeah, so you would say maybe more sort of mentoring schemes is the way to go. More attention by publishers on doing those sorts of initiatives. Would that be the main thing that you feel would help the situation?
Definitely, just to expand the repertoire of what's available and who's making it. It is impossible to escape from the fact that because of the way that we all live in the same somewhat racist society, the people who are controlling all the various parts of the media are all white, and their decisions are all made, because they want to do things that make sense to them. And it sounds like it's a very radical thing to suggest, but actually, if you just think about what media looks like, you can see that it's very hard to change representation. If you think about what you see on film and TV, if you think about who gets to talk and who doesn't get to talk, you notice that there's not much real diversity in terms of what people can do. Black people and non-white people generally tend to be confined to specialist roles. If someone's on TV, they're usually talking about some aspect of their blackness, that's why they're there. You don't just see, a black geologist or a black baker or a black bus driver or a black expert on geology unless they're talking about some region where that might be. Your color is always tied to your expertise in some way, which doesn't happen for white people. Obviously, a white person can talk about anything with authority because there's no question about it. So that's how it is all the time, and we don't think about that because that's just how it is. But if you start to interrogate the things, you realize, there's a lot of work to be done in all these areas.
Thanks, Woodrow. We've got a couple of minutes left. We do have some questions from the audience. We've got time for one. Do the panelists think that France is more open to a diversity of topics, including non-fiction, and viewpoints being seen in graphic form? And is this different or changing in Anglophone markets? Who would like to answer that one? Lucy, how would you feel? So the question is, do the panelists think that France is more open to a diversity of topics and viewpoints being seen in graphic form? And is this different or changing in the UK market?
I don't know for the UK market, but I feel like the French scene, if it's not about as we talked about the question of representation of character, but about the topics and the graphic form is very, very open to a lot of diversity. And I feel like some the other big industry of comics like US or Japan are more, I would say, sorry, renfermés sur eux-mêmes, more self-aware of their own production, but not so open on the rest of the world. And for example, I'm always quite shocked that the comic festival in US have a prize for foreign comics. It's not such a thing in France. There's not a foreign prize at Angoulême. It's just comic prize for every comics in every country of the world. So I think there is this kind of yes, this openness on diversity in French scene, but I don't know how it can be compared to the UK market.
Would someone else like to comment on that?
Me, I don't know the Anglo-Saxon market, but I would have said that it's more diverse in the British or English-speaking countries. I don't know why, but this is the feeling I have. It's not so diverse in the French market or French-speaking market. It's diverse because it's diverse for the graphical form, indeed, like Lucie said. But as a representation of diversity, I don't think it's so diverse. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I agree, but it's a lot about the form or the like narrative structures, this kind of thing, the kind of project. But diversity of characters and representation of culture, I think, it's not so much. And as I said, I feel like UK are more like, I don't know, progressist about this question. Like there is a question about diversity in the French Institute in UK. There wouldn't be such a thing in France, I think.
That's an interesting comment in itself. We are out of time. It's already 7:30 UK time. I'd like to say thank you very much to all three of the panelists today, Woodrow Phoenix, Barak Rima, and Lucie Kemer. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our host, the French Institute, for agreeing to do this topic, and also to everybody watching, most importantly. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to all your questions, but we're out of time. My name's Emma, and thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.